According to a statistic at the University of Florida, the odds of being murdered in a national park in 1995 were about 1 in 20 million, less than the odds of drowning in one's own bathtub. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of California True Crime. I'm Sean, and with me is Charles and Jessica. How are you guys tonight?
I'm doing great. Thank you for asking.
Me too.
Good. This is a little different. It's been a while since if you haven't listened, we just finished a 13 episode on Silvina Pelosso, and tonight we will be covering Cary Stayner. I think it is important, if you can, go back and listen to Silvina Pelosso, because we'll be talking about things or brushing lightly over some things that we already talked about in Silvina Stayner's episodes. Also, with this on Cary, there are a lot of episodes, different podcasts and everything, or TV episodes such as 2020, and we are doing these. We're pretty sure it's going to be 2 episodes, and we're going to do it the way that we think is how we want to tell it. It's our timeline, our story. We might leave some things out that you've heard, or you might hear some new things, but this will be our take on it. The information that we'll be sharing comes from a lot of different newspapers, websites. We also use some books here and there, which I'll talk about, but it will all be on CaliforniaTrueCrime.com.
We'd also like to let you know that one of the main sources of information that we used for this episode comes from Jeffrey Reinick's book, In the Name of the Children. The book really centers around Mr. Reinick's life in the FBI. He's actually a retired FBI agent, and this is kind of a look back on his career. His career really centers on cases involving children. And one of the highest profile cases that he actually worked on was the Yosemite Murders. And the way he came about this case, we're actually going to talk about as we go along in these episodes. But if you have a chance, pick the book up. It is amazing. I read it and liked it. In fact, we all 3 read it. And I actually thought it was probably one of the best true crime books I've read ever. If you like anything that we've talked about, California-specific cases, I highly recommend it. Although there is a warning. The cases that Mr. Reinick deals with involve children. This book is not for the faint of heart, but it is a really good, in-depth look about what law enforcement agents have to go through when they deal with cases involving children, and really some of the things that have gone on that don't get on the evening news that you may have never heard of, obviously other than the Yosemite murders.
It's also a good book if you're really interested in hearing about the victims. It does a really good job of putting them, they're the focus of each chapter. So I think a lot of our listeners like that, so a lot of them will enjoy this book.
Yeah, if you like anything at all about true crime, or really, and even if you're not a true crime fan, I can see somebody that wasn't a true crime fan reading this book. And if this sounds like an advertisement, I apologize, but huge fan.
So most people know this story, but we'll start at the beginning. Cary Stayner was born on August 13th, 1961. From the other episodes about Stephen and stuff, you got to know some of his family. He had his brother Stephen, who was kidnapped in 1972 at the age of 7. His parents, Delbert and Kay, and his 3 sisters, which they all grew up in Merced, California. We talked a lot about Merced. I think it was episode 1 or 2 of Silvina Stayner. So if you want to go back and hear some history of Merced, you can. There's not too much on Cary's childhood. Cary was 10 when Stephen was kidnapped, and with this happening, you can't really say that it would have been a normal childhood after that. If you think about it, Kenneth Parnell, the man who did kidnap Stephen, really kidnapped the whole family in a sense. His one horrible deed completely put everyone in an alternate universe. I mean, this can happen in any case, such as like a car accident or in any life-changing moment. But because of the kidnapping, Cary's parents seemed to be completely focused on finding Stephen at the time. His brother's kidnapping really seemed to bother Cary. Cary says in an interview with Mike Eccles, Mike Eccles was the one that wrote the book, I Know My Name is Stephen. And what we learned about Mike Eccles from the Steven Stayner episodes, you can take whatever he says with a grain of salt, but this is technically a quote from the book. Quote, I remember going out one night after Stephen disappeared and wishing on a star that my brother would come back home. And I did that almost every clear night from then on until Stephen finally came back home. I never did tell anybody about it, but I remember wishing on a star that my little brother would come back home. When Stephen did finally come home, he says, quote, I walked several blocks away and then looked up at the stars and started to wish on one again. But then I remembered that Stephen was back home, so I thanked the stars instead. When we were doing the research and talking about Stephen and everything, I didn't really think about it until we went over Stephen's homecoming and how he says in the quote, I walked several blocks away to wish on the stars, and how we talked about like the big, seemed like party that went on when Stephen came home and the guy brought a keg, and he probably just wanted to get away from this giant crowd. So he says he walked a couple blocks.
And he would have been 18, I think, at the time?
Yeah, he was 18.
Right, and he found out that it must have been a shock because he found out on the radio on a ride home from Yosemite as a young man.
Right. So with hearing that, he hadn't seen his brother. He comes home to this giant crowd of just lights, cameras, the whole shebang. And he seems like he just always needs to be kind of isolated anyway. So it seems like he just walked off. While attending junior high, he was in GATE class. It stands for Gifted and Talented Education. This is when they throw the kids in a classroom that they think they might be smarter. I was in GATE, and one of my classmates is actually in prison for murder, so I don't know what the classrooms really do. Cary was an artist and a cartoonist also. He was always drawing things. He would do a comic strip for the Merced High School, which was called Party Hardy, which is, the name is just totally 80s. From his peers, he was awarded most creative, and everyone thought he was going to be an artist. Friends said that they can't remember him dating anyone at the time, and even though there was girls interested in him, he just didn't seem to take notice. What his friends could recall is that he would say something like, yeah, those girls are pretty, but nothing would ever come to fruition. There's a different account from one of Cary's sister's friends who would stay the night over at the house. She was 14, and at this time, Cary was 16. One night she was staying the night. Cary snuck into the room where she was sleeping on a cot. Before we go any farther, this is the second time I've mentioned a cot. We talked about it in Keddy. And I never slept on a cot. Anytime I'd stay the night anywhere, it was like a yoga mat or just the floor, a sleeping bag. Do you guys sleep on cots?
I did, actually. I had a friend whose family was really into camping. And so anytime you went over there, they actually had a cot set up. It was, so instead of sleeping on the floor or, like a crappy couch, it was actually pretty nice.
Okay.
But but it wasn't something, it was something unique.
Right. I think I went camping once my whole childhood. And then none of my friends, I never went with them. I don't remember them camping. So
yeah, I definitely slept on a lot of cots. We went camping all the time. And so it was always nice when a friend had a cot too. When you wanted to spend the night, you wanted to sleep on the floor because it was before those blow-up mattresses.
Yeah.
And this family, from what I researched, they spent a lot of time outdoors and going camping, so kind of makes sense.
That they would have extra cots for when the kids came over.
Yeah.
So back to this, while she was sleeping on the cot, Cary came in, snuck under the cot, and grabbed her breasts while she was sleeping. She kind of woke up, saw that it was him, and said, "Get out," which he did. And then a little bit later, he came back in and he was standing naked in the doorway. She told him to go away again, which he did, and he didn't come back. So going back to like the standing naked, another story from one of his high school friends is that they used to streak in front of girls for fun. I know that the grabbing of the girl's breast is absolutely wrong. And that coupled with coming back and standing in the doorway naked, this whole scene is horrible. But to me, streaking with friends seemed like just a thing that kids would do in the 80s.
Yeah, him groping that young girl and then standing in the doorway, that to me is all part of one assault. And I mean, when we did our last episodes, we learned that about 26% of all sex crimes are committed by people under the age of 18. So, I mean, I know he's only 16 and she's 14, but it's still, she obviously said no and she asked him to leave. It's frustrating to hear.
Well, and I think too, this is another instance of something that might go on, and a lot of people would, and I hate to use the term laugh off, but it's the one I want to use because it's the first one that comes to my mind, almost minimize it. Like, oh, like you said, Sean, that's a terrible thing to happen. But I can see I'm not a young girl, obviously, but I might be too embarrassed to say something, or I might laugh it off and say, oh, it's the older brother of my best friend. I don't want to get him in trouble. But this could be a serious warning sign. Now, obviously, we know how this particular story with Cary ends, so trying not to metagame, as it were, but it could be a warning sign that should have been dealt with earlier.
Well, and it's wrong on its own. I think in 2019, when we're trying to have more conversations about this, and I think women do experience a lot of these things throughout the years. You know, you see someone who's exposed himself on BART or whatever, or in public, and you feel like you're supposed to just laugh it off. And I think someone in this age would also feel that way. I have a lot of friends and things that happen to me kind of similar, and you just feel like you have to ignore it or go on. So I think it's just important to talk about from that perspective.
And I wonder if that allows somebody with, I don't want to say, it's not like everybody that does this becomes a serial killer.
No.
But it allows these kinds of smaller crimes. That's not a small crime, but these offenses to keep going on, and the person to keep getting bolder and bolder. Well, obviously she didn't say anything, so then I can try this other thing.
After high school, he would have different jobs, nothing that seemed too connected to his artistic skills at all. One of them was he was a furniture mover. He also worked at an aluminum company. The job that he seemed to do the most was installing glass for different companies. He would fix windows and install and build shower stalls. After work, he would go to friends' houses and hang out, watch TV or other things. Everything just seemed very uneventful. He just had a routine of getting through life pretty much. I guess, like going back to everything we're saying, nothing really threw up red flags besides this incident that probably came out after he was arrested. You can't really say this like anyone knew he was going to be who he was. So with Cary out of high school, this is when Stephen was able to escape and now came home to live with the family again. He still lived at home at this time. From many accounts, it seemed like everything was about Stephen and Cary was kind of put on the back burner. One story I read was Mike Eccles, the book writer, was actually over there for dinner, and Kay was making dinner and did all the place settings, and Stephen said, you're missing a place setting, and Kay was like, who? And Stephen pointed at Cary, and she said, oh yeah, Cary, like totally just not even thinking about him.
And that was one of the things I had read as Stephen got older. It was one of his regrets that after he came home, he really bonds with his sisters and gets to know them, and they're closer in age. But because Cary is so much older and he's getting ready to leave the house, they never really form a bond or a brotherly relationship, they're not close.
But what I read, this is on Cary also, because when he came home, Cary was jealous of like all the attention he was getting. Cary wasn't, I mean, I don't think Cary was very much in a spotlight, but his whole family kind of seemed to, not talk to him anymore that much. So, but he said in articles that he was jealous of Stephen, so it's not all on Stephen not being able to bond with him. This is Cary probably putting up a wall to not bond.
And he spent a lot of time, too, away from the home. as he got older, he spent a lot of time in Yosemite. He spent a lot. I mean, you just talked about how he's gotten a lot of these jobs that he's gone. He's an adult trying to make somewhat of a living.
Well, and it's interesting to see something like the media attention, which affects the family in different ways. Stephen's not happy with it or anything, and then it's making Cary a little jealous. It's just, this whole thing is such a big part of their life.
You mentioned it too earlier, the idea that Parnell kidnapped the whole family. So we said a lot, none of the family is comfortable with this level of spotlight, and everyone dealt with it in their own way.
So I'm not really sure if this whole jealousy or everything about his home life was so bad that the next decision he did was out of a necessity. But in 1990, Cary goes on to live with his uncle Jesse, who went by Jerry. Now, Uncle Jesse, in a defense that was used for Cary, they talked about how Cary was molested by an uncle. It does not use his name. And then in another article that I found of Radford University that talks about Cary and his life and everything that he did, it actually claims that it was Uncle Jesse. I just want to put that out there. I don't know if this was the uncle, but in one article it did say it was. So Cary's living with Uncle Jesse at this time. And on December 26, 1990, Jesse came home for lunch and walked in on a burglary at his home. Jesse was killed from a single gunshot to the chest from a small caliber handgun. This information comes from the Santa Rosa Press-Democrat. And then in later articles, this was from 1990, but in later articles, it actually says he was killed with a shotgun. So I'm not sure which gun it is. He was found on the floor of his home at 1321 Brantley Street in Merced, California. A neighbor was passing by and saw that his door was open, so he stopped to check on him. Also, the truck he was driving, a 1989 Chevy Silverado, which he drove for his employer, which was Levitt's Chopping Service, was stolen. Cary was questioned, but police did not suspect him to be the murderer. Even after he was caught for the other murders, they said they would look more into this of Uncle Jesse being murdered by Cary, but I never found any updates that they went further with it. So from the years of 1990 to 97, lack of a better term, it was kind of boring for Cary. We don't have many stories. We do know in 1991 he did attempt suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning, but that's pretty much all I found from that time frame. On March 28th, 1997, he was arrested and booked in the Merced County Jail for drug-related charges. I read an article that said he was at a friend's house who was growing marijuana plants, and he was released 2 days later with no charges, and the article said he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So at or around this same time of 97 is when Cary was working for Merced Glass and Mirror, doing his glass working things. His friend Mike, who I don't know if he worked there also, went behind the shop and saw Cary repeatedly punching a piece of plywood, and because of this, his hands were all cut and bloody. Cary said to Mike about this that, quote, he said he felt like he was having a nervous breakdown and said he was all nervous and didn't know why. He said he felt like getting into his truck, driving into the office, and killing the boss and everyone else in there and torching the place. Mike also said, quote, I told him he might have a chemical imbalance, and he said, I have been told I have, but nothing has ever been done about it. Mike went inside and told the boss, who then drove Stayner to the Merced Psychiatric Center, where he received some counseling. He wasn't admitted, and it looked like Stayner then returned to his place of business, picked up his check, and never returned to work. Stayner told his boss that he was planning on moving to Santa Cruz. His boss didn't seem to have anything bad to say about Cary and thought of him as a reliable worker.
Again, it seems like one of those, we talked about hindsight. Oh, it's a red flag. It's not something normal.
Yeah, that story is a little more like you say those words after you're punching a piece of wood until your hands are super bloody. Those words enough should be a little more than just going and getting some counseling where you're just like gone.
True, but I can see, I mean, from his, again, it's one of those instances of, hey, you have a chemical imbalance. Yeah, I've been told that. Like, you know, everybody gets angry. I won't say I've ever punched a wall until my fingers or knuckles are bloody, but the fact that his boss took him to get counseling, but he hasn't, up to this point, he hasn't hurt anyone. They can't keep him. You know, I mean, he's there voluntarily. They do what they can, and then let him go.
Instead of moving to Santa Cruz in the summer of 1997 is when he moved into the Cedar Lodge in El Portal, California. He rented a room there for $90 a month. He also got a job at the lodge as a maintenance man. El Portal is a small town, roughly around 500 people. Looking at the demographics, it's mainly made of white people, and it is in Mariposa County. It had its establishment in 1885 as a, quote, company town, and this was for mining and logging, railroad. It lies along State Route 140, which is the gateway to Yosemite, which we've talked about many a times. It's by the Merced River, located on the western boundary of Yosemite National Park. It is also partly under the administrative jurisdiction of Yosemite National Park.
I also found it kind of interesting that El Portal was another example of a Sierra Nevada company town, where a company would come in and the company would own the town, and all of the modes of production are owned by a specific company. So the workers made up the population. They lived in government housing. Not government housing, company housing. And a portion of their salary would then go to pay their rent. So you shop at the company store, you eat dinner at a company restaurant, you pay rent to a company that owns your house, and then you work for that same company, 14 or 15 hours a day.
And Mariposa County, if you go up there, if anybody has a chance, there's a lot of cool old buildings and stuff there's historical stuff that they've preserved and places to go. You can see a lot of the old tools that were used for both logging and mining and things like that. So if you get up that way.
And they have a great historical society museum that talks about the mining and native history of the area, but also a lot has to do with like the development of the company town.
So with El Portal being part of Yosemite National Forest, we should talk about this being a vacation destination for all. It's a pretty amazing place. It has amazing waterfalls. It's home to Half Dome, which people can climb if they want to do that. Ansel Adams, he loved taking pictures of this place. I went to Yosemite once with my friend Zach, and it was a pretty exciting vacation. For one, they tell you to lock up all your food in metal lockers because the bears will come and get your stuff. After the first night, we headed to the parking lot, and some people didn't listen. Cars had broken windows, and there was like ice chests laying on the ground. We also hiked up Vernal Falls, which was quite a feat, especially for someone at this time being extremely out of shape and hungover from the night before. But it's a pretty long hike, and then you have to climb up 600 gigantic stone steps while there's this waterfall making it wet, and there's no rails, and I'm scared of heights, so it was terrifying, but it was fun. If you've never been, you should at least try to visit once. And from El Portal to Yosemite is only about a 30-minute drive.
I'm B.
I'm CC.
And this is Murder City,
True Crime of Houston, Texas. Slow down and take a trip through H-Town.
Discover the dirtier side of the Bayou City as we discuss Houston's homicides and search for answers to unsolved murders and missing persons of our community. Lean back
and keep it trail
with Murder City. Find us at murdercitypod.com
and on Twitter and Instagram at MurderCityPod. Houston is out.
So here we will start getting into the story that made Cary Stayner a name that we know, which separates him from his brother. This case has taken on many names, such as the Yosemite Murders, the Sightseer Murders, or the Cedar Lodge Murders. Let's start with giving you a little background on the victims. Carol's son was 42. Julie's son, 15, and Silvina Pelosso, 16. The sons lived in Eureka, California, which is Northern California, right on the coast. Carol and her husband lived a nice life. Carol's family did very well in the real estate market, but she didn't use her privilege and do nothing with it. She was always volunteering and helping children in the foster system. She fought for rights for these children. She also helped adults with developmental challenges work towards their independence. In short, she did a lot that a lot of people don't do. Her and her husband Jens also adopted 3 siblings from foster care. Carol also had her daughter Julie, and her and Silvina were friends since they were children. Silvina's mother, Raquel Pelosso, was an exchange student in Michigan during her senior year, and that's when she became very close friends with Carol. Carol then spent her senior year of high school as an exchange student in Argentina on Raquel's family ranch. They stayed close friends from then on. Just like their mothers did, Silvina came to Eureka and had a semester with Julie at her high school. While here, they did a lot of touristy fun things like Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco and Disneyland. On February 12th, this was another one of those planned type of trips. Carol, Julie, and Silvina flew from Eureka, California to San Francisco. There, they rented a red 1999 Pontiac Grand Prix and drove to UOP in Stockton so Julie could compete in a regional cheerleading competition. The competition was held on Saturday the next day. Julie really seemed to like the college, and they made plans to go back on Tuesday before heading back to the airport. So on Sunday, they drove to Yosemite from Stockton. They took the route of traveling Highway 140, which I find interesting. From where they were, they could have just traveled east and gone through places like Copperopolis, Chinese Camp, and Groveland. But instead of taking this way, they decided to go south on 99 and actually go the 140, the gateway to Yosemite. And I thought about this a lot because there could have been many reasons they could have done this. There could have been something they really wanted to see that way. Another thing, this was in February, and the weather could have just been really horrible going to Chinese Camp or Copperopolis, because if they would have just went east, it would have cut it off an hour. It should take them 3 hours to get there the way that they went. So after making this drive, they make their way to the Cedar Lodge in El Portal and check into room 509. The next day, they did vacation stuff. There are pictures of them doing vacation stuff. I think there's one where they're ice skating. You have another of Carol and Julie with the Merced River in the background. On the evening of February 15th, they ate dinner at the Cedar Lodge restaurant. They then rented the movie Jerry Maguire and watched it in the room. At around 11 p.m., there was a knock on their hotel door from Cary. Carol thought this was a little late to get a knock, so she just opened the window instead of the door and talked to him through the window. He told them that he needed to make a repair in the bathroom, but Carol was a little skeptical and said no. He said, okay, but I'm going to need to go to the manager, and he would make me come right back and fix it. So she decided to let him in to do the work. He went into the bathroom carrying his work bag, which was actually a murder bag. I'm not a big fan of that term, but a lot of different articles say murder bag. It's a bag filled with things to help with his plan. This bag consists of rope, a roll of black duct tape, a gun, and a long serrated knife. After acting like he was fixing something in the bathroom for a little bit, he came out holding a gun, saying that he was desperate. He bound and gagged everyone and put the 2 young girls in the bathroom.
I had read in some articles that before she lets him in and she tells him no, that he goes next door and pretends to be working in that room to kind of convince her. Is that something you read about, or?
Yeah, actually, I'd read the same thing. I believe that actually comes from a section out of Reinek's book on the timeline of some of the crimes. But to me, that shows, much like him carrying around the, as you call it, the work bag or his murder bag, and shows that his ability to manipulate people into doing something that normally they wouldn't. Like you said, Carol's a a competent woman, a good head on her shoulders. You know, she's successful. She has 2 young girls under her care. It's 11 o'clock at night at a place that they're not familiar with. And some strange man comes knocking on the door, and he was able to manipulate his way inside to perpetrate these horrible crimes. To me, that shows a level of understanding how to manipulate people that Cary had.
It fits with a lot of the grooming stuff we've talked about.
Right. It's a good callback to some of the techniques that we talked about to other perpetrators like Parnell.
Yeah, all this seems very pretty much maybe not the situation planned out, but he has a plan all in his head. This is very studied, and like reading about how he comes out of the bathroom, says he's desperate, holding a gun, then ties him up. This is very similar to the Zodiac murder at Lake Berryessa, where he does pretty much the same thing. He even uses the words, "I'm desperate." After the girls were in the bathroom, he first strangled Carol's son with a 3-foot piece of rope, taking 5 minutes. In an interview later, Cary says, quote, "I didn't realize how hard it is to strangle a person. It's not easy. I had very little feeling. It was like performing a task." He then put her body in the trunk of the rental car. He came back and he put the girls on the bed. He cut and ripped off their clothing and tried to have them perform sexual acts. Silvina, being very upset, could not stop crying. He took her into the bathroom and strangled her in the bathtub. After this, more sexual assaults happened to Julie, and at one point she needed to use the restroom, so being the maintenance man with a key, they just went to the next room over because he didn't want Julie to see Silvina. Another thing is that this was a Monday after a 3-day weekend, so there was hardly anyone still checked into the hotel. There wasn't anyone really around at the time. One thing I found interesting is that the rooms were super far away from the front desk. This was because the lodge didn't have a normal cleaning service. I'm guessing during a peak vacation time they might, but this was wintertime. So instead of cleaning rooms every day, they would just put people in different rooms farther out, and then a cleaning service would come and do it all at once. With them checking out on a Sunday, that's most likely why their room was so far away, because the other ones were either occupied or dirty already. After more sexual assaults in the new room, he tied Julie back up and turned on the TV for a while when he went back to the other room to clean up. He moved Silvina into the trunk of the car also. He would then wipe things down that might have fingerprints, packed up everything in the room. He left the room key on the floor. He even dampened towels, so it seemed like they had just left kind of quickly without a proper checkout. He might not have planned the attack, but he definitely knew what he was doing and cleaned up after knowing that what he just did.
He planned for the eventuality that something could happen.
Yeah. After this, he wrapped Julie in a blanket and put her in the car with him. They drove around for a while, and Julie tried to stay calm and make small talk. She told him that her name was Sarah, and they kept driving, which seemed to have no real destination. They pulled into Lake Don Pedro by Moccasin Point. This is roughly about 90 minutes away from the Cedar Lodge. This next part will get kind of graphic, so I'm just warning you. He carried her up a trail, quote, kind of like a groom carrying a bride over the threshold. He told her that he wished he could keep her. Then after sexually assaulting her again, quote, I bunched her hair up in a ponytail on top of her head and pulled her hair back and told her I loved her and I slit her throat. Julie was on her knees pointing her fingers at her head as if she wanted to be shot. Then she tumbled down the hillside under a brush. He said he then slit her throat because he didn't want her to suffer the way the other two did.
I think it's really interesting during all of this, she's able to keep, I don't know, composure is the wrong word, but I mean little things as a victim, you know, not giving him her real name or
trying to involve him in small talk.
Yeah. And I know 2 months, I think it was about 2 months before this happened, there had been 2 girls in Eureka, I think at their high school, who had been raped at knife point. And Julie had become really involved in groups there, trying to make it safer for people. So maybe some of that comes from knowing about it and talking to victims already. But it's just amazing that it's terrible that this happened, but she seemed pretty amazing.
That part of the story also shows to me that Cary, just the depths of depravity and the monster that he really is. He has no compunction about killing these people, and what, even going back to Carol, his describing like, oh, I didn't think it would take as long. It's really hard. Yeah, it's terrible. You're committing a violent act, and he's more concerned with the process, not the act itself. And then his description of carrying this woman like a bride is gruesome. And then him killing her in a way that, because, she's suffering. Yeah, she's been suffering through this entire thing. And that in no time dawned on you it's almost like a disconnect.
Yeah, he seems completely out of reality. He's in his own fantasy.
So yeah, it's something that he's been looking forward to for a long time. And now it's reality.
Yeah, like Sean said, this is just his fantasy. These aren't real people that he gets to know or have people who love them or friends. They're not real to him. They're just kind of like dolls, characters in his sick fantasy that comes before anything else. And I think the part where he comes into the room and he says, what does he say?
I'm desperate.
That part, it's interesting you hear the Lake Berryessa thing. I hear someone like putting their own sexual needs before the people in the room and is almost aware of that. But these people are still just nothing. They're just something he needs to do.
Everything in the story is there for Cary's fulfillment.
Yeah.
With going off what you just said, Charles, the story that we hear about a lot of them, we only hear it from the murderer, the monster.
Right.
This is their story. We don't even know if this is really how it even happened, because you hear it only from the person still alive.
Right. There's always the physical evidence that in some cases that the detectives and investigators can find, but feelings, motivations, what the victims go through, and it just adds another level of gruesomeness. The fact that we're hearing about these people's last moments that are filled with pain and terror through the person who's causing that pain and terror.
After this, Cary drove the car with the women still in the trunk to a little secluded road between Miwok and Long Barn and left it there. This area, this is like a little cabin town where a lot of people like to vacation. It's kind of like Ketty before the train station was closed. There's a little lake called Pinecrest that people like to hang out at. It has a good hiking trail all the way around it. This drive from Lake Don Pedro to Long Barn area is about 45 minutes. After leaving the car, he walked a little ways to the Sierra Village where he called a cab. The cab driver, Jenny Horvath, then drove him back to Yosemite Valley, which actually cost Cary $125. As they drove, Cary talked about how he had seen Bigfoot in Yosemite, which Cary very much believed in. When Jenny testifies, she says that Cary was very friendly on the trip. Cary also goes back a couple days later, and he writes, "We have Sarah" on the car, but then burns the car. So that's all lost in the for future. But he does burn the car a couple days later. But getting back to Bigfoot, Charles, could you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, this was an interesting thing for me because when I was younger and I remember this case in the news and things like that, I really didn't remember any mention of Bigfoot at all. And then in the researching the case and talking about it and this coming up, and like you said, Cary was very, very adamant about belief in Bigfoot after having an experience in the foothills seeing Bigfoot near a barn on a particular afternoon. And then from then on, when he was younger, from then on out, had absolute certainty that it was real. And apparently from a lot of different sources that if given the chance, he would talk to you at length about it. But if you're not familiar, which I'm not too sure if you're listening to this podcast, if you're not familiar with Bigfoot, but it's possible. Bigfoot is a large bipedal creature that reportedly wanders the Pacific Northwest mainly, also parts of Canada, and actually there's sightings now. There are sightings all over the United States. But according to a recent poll that was done by the Bigfoot Field Research Organization, which is an organization that I am not endorsing, but I am using for a source of information, that California actually is second in the world to Bigfoot sightings outside of Washington state. So a couple other odd facts about Bigfoot in California that I looked up. Actually, the first mention in California of Bigfoot that was in print was from 1958, and it was a journalist, Andrew, and I apologize for the name, Genzoli. He was from the Humboldt Times. He actually highlighted a letter that was sent into the Humboldt Times from loggers in Northern California who had mysteriously, and I'm doing air quotes, mysteriously found large footprints around the logging site. And he made a joke and editorialized, "Hey, we have an abominable snowman like in the Himalayas, and it's right here." And that's kind of the first time that it happened, and it was actually in his article on September 21st, 1958, along with this letter that he printed, that we get any real mention in California in a public record sense. You know, there are reported stories that, depending on who you read, go back a lot longer than that. When Genzoli was actually interviewed, he said that he put it in the paper because he thought it would be funny. You know, that, oh, it's just kind of a fun day, Sunday story about this weird things. He was shocked that more people wrote in about that than almost anything else he was writing at the time. And then that's basically how the term Bigfoot kind of caught on, and that's from Northern California. And then it's not really until 1967 the famous Patterson-Gimlin film gets shot. And when I say this, I'm sure you have an image of Bigfoot walking across in real grainy, shaky 8mm footage across like near a river. And that's the Patterson-Gimlin film. And that was also shot in Northern California. And other than the Zapruder film with the assassination of Kennedy, it's one of those films that everyone's seen and re-seen a million times. The footage was shot alongside Bluff Creek, which is a tributary of the Klamath River. It's a 25-mile long stretch of northwest Orleans, California, in Del Norte County. The film site is actually about 38 miles south of Oregon and 18 miles east of the Pacific Ocean, if you're looking at a California map. Also, some statistics on California sightings of Bigfoot. Again, I thought this was kind of interesting. Like I said earlier, California is, again, the second most prolific place to see Bigfoot really anywhere. And if you were to look at totally, there's about 23,000 sightings of Bigfoot in the country. And out of that, 1,697 sightings are in California alone. And this is according to some research that actually the Travel Channel did in conjunction with the Bigfoot Field Research Organization, which, again, it's an organization I don't advocate for. But if you have watched the show Finding Bigfoot, that's where you know them from. Washington is the only state with more Bigfoot sightings than California, and theirs is 2,032 sightings.
On the evening of February 16th, Carol and the girls were supposed to meet Carol's husband Jens at the San Francisco airport. Jens talked about in an interview how meticulous of a record keeper Carol was and wouldn't just not do something planned or something on the whim. This was also a time, 99, cell phones weren't good. I mean, people still might have had pagers, so it's hard to get a hold of people at this time. The next day, he couldn't get a hold of Carol, so he called the police. Since Cary had straightened up the room, everyone thought that they had just checked out. So the police started a search for them and their car, because the thought was that since it was poor driving conditions on the 16th, if they were driving towards San Francisco, they might have went off the side of the road. If you've driven to Yosemite, it's a very tall mountain and it gets crazy high. There was hardly any guardrails when I went. I remember my trip with my friend Zach. He had this like disgusting beige station wagon and just didn't even feel like it was going to make it up the mountain, but just going up, I was scared. Now, on Friday the 19th, 3 days later, Carol's wallet was found in the city of Modesto, which, if you listen to the Mark Adams case, you know a little history about that. Jessica, I think you know where it was actually found?
Yeah, the wallet is found. It's found in a median on two pretty busy streets in Modesto, at the intersection of Brixmore and Tully. And it's found, I believe, in a median. So these are really big streets, so they have really long crosswalks. And if you've ever seen a crosswalk like that, in the middle, there's often concrete. So you can stop if you don't make it all the way across before the light changes. And I think that's where they find it there.
Modesto is about 2 to 3 hours drive from the Cedar Lodge. So after this discovery, the FBI moved in to help with the investigation and started really checking all around, including Modesto. They would set up press conferences from Modesto, and what they said about the wallet, that it could have been lost in Yosemite and just thrown out in Modesto. Them finding the wallet there seemed to bring up a lot more questions than answering anything they had before. So Carol's husband and Carol's parents kind of moved to Modesto for a while and stay at the Holiday Inn there. They seem to be doing everything that they could trying to find the girls. At this time, flyers started going up everywhere of the missing girls, which had a $250,000 reward to find them. So I was living in Modesto at this time of this all going on, and I remember being in a town very close by, getting some gas, and I heard some guys talking about it at the gas station, like the attendant and a guy. And that's when I first saw the flyer and stuff. I didn't really know about it. Did you guys have your own stories of this case?
So there are really two ways into Yosemite. We've talked a lot about Highway 140. There's another highway called Highway 108, 120, which kind of comes down the other side of Stanislaus County. And I live in a city in that area. And so when this happened, I remember all of the police going through town because they were searching. Both police as well as their friends were searching up and down the 120 and I think the 140. And there were helicopters flying over and they were bringing dogs up. They were looking for them everywhere.
Yeah, it was the same. I can remember it was the one thing that everybody talked about. You know, everybody was talking about what could have happened to them, pictures everywhere.
And we've talked a lot about the places that get affected by these things. Down here in the valley as well, I have a lot of family up in the mountains along the 120 and the 108. So the emotions and people were very scared, not knowing what was going on, as well as these aren't people from this area, so they weren't known to people around here. But that was also really scary too. And I think it happening and people going missing in a place we all spend so much time in had a really big effect on people.
And I don't remember too many people talking about it. It seemed like a lot of people went directly to foul play. I really don't have a clear memory of a lot of people saying, oh, the car may have went off the road or, you know, something, an accident hiking. It really was something bad happened to him.
And the search was really centered, like you said, in Modesto, especially after they find that wallet, which is just down the street from where, like, I was going to college at the time. And everything gets centered there. So there's people calling in tips. And I remember they were searching rivers in Merced, I think. And it was just because they had no idea where they were. And
the other big memory I do have, because I spent a lot of time in Modesto around this time as well, was the news media. Because it really was not, and I don't have a lot of clear memories of a lot of news media around Modesto. I mean, I know after this, we've had a lot of cases where Modesto is kind of in the center of the news, but at the time it was weird seeing a lot of, like, you know, statewide news agencies parked out in front of motels or hotels, or, you know, going around, and you'd see people on the corner in the corner of Brixmore and Tully and filming that and then I was just down there on the news later that night.
I remember it a lot more in the Peterson case, but not so much of this. Everyone ended up searching for them for over a month with no clues at all of what happened to them. After nothing, the FBI would hold a press conference that they now thought that the girls were victims of a violent crime. On March 18th, 1999, the Pontiac Grand Prix was found by a man named Jim Powers. He was a passerby, and he discovered the car on a remote road, which is off of Highway 108. It wasn't reported until 2 days later that Carol and Silvina were found inside the burned car. They also, at the time, didn't know who the two bodies were because they needed to use dental records to actually identify them. While they're figuring this out and processing the evidence from the car, on March 24th, a letter came in to the Modesto FBI office in which Special Agent Anthony Alston opened it. In the letter was a crudely drawn map that would show where Julie was. It was drawn like a treasure map with a trail coming off Highway 108 around Lake Don Pedro. It actually had an X marks the spot on it. On the map, it was also written, "We had fun with this one." The next day, the map ended up actually leading authorities to the body of Julie Sund. Her body was nude with duct tape on her ankles and was hidden under some brush.
So that kind of goes back to what you talked about with Cary really planning out what, because otherwise, why send this note in?
I'm not really sure. I mean, it seems like the car's found and the letter comes 2 days later. So he might have saw that and then I don't know what he was thinking.
Throw him off the we had, instead of making it that it was two people or more people rather than just a single person.
Yeah, and maybe they didn't bring up the "we have Sarah" because it was burned off of the car. So maybe he wanted to throw in a "we" again just to, like you're saying, throw him off.
Right. I think it goes back to showing that he's manipulating the aftermath of his crimes, and it's not just random.
So now all three women were discovered, and this is where the police and FBI might have gone on the wrong path. They started looking into a bunch of people who had a record of sex offenses, drug convictions, or weapon arrests. Somehow this led them to a man who had shot a Modesto police officer and another man, this man's half-brother, who had many run-ins with the law. There were also two others that were on their radar, the couple of women that might have known these people. On April 7th, a grand jury in Fresno started hearing statements and testimonies against these people. So the guy that shot the police officer in Modesto, he was actually convicted of rape in Tuolumne County in the 80s, which this would cover both Yosemite and Long Barn. And his father grew up in Long Barn, so it kind of connects the dots of location, kind of seemed very circumstantial. Also, where the wallet was found, this was a mile away from where this guy lives, but being Modesto and being a mile away, if you go for like a radius, there's a lot of residential, so that's
a lot of people to pull from.
Yeah, and that's kind of a stretch, being like just a mile, I think.
I also thought one of the reasons that they focused in on this man in particular is because I think Carol's identity, either her credit card number was stolen and they started to see activity or someone was calling about it, and it led them to these people. So it was almost like a terrible coincidence that they had this information at the same time they had gone missing.
Like these people had found the wallet, taken the stuff, taken like the credit card out of the wallet.
It's possible, but I believe they found the credit cards with the wallet. So I'm not exactly sure how. I mean, you can get your identity stolen in a bunch of ways, especially when you're on vacation and you're using things all the time. But
and at that time, you didn't hear about identity fraud as much as you probably do now. People may not have been on the look for it.
So this grand jury goes on for a while, and I'm just guessing they think that they have the right men, so the search kind of ends. They kept these men in custody and assured California that they have the right men for the Yosemite murders. In an article in the San Francisco Gate in 1999, one of the suspects told the FBI that he had nothing to do with these murders, but later he was promised that everything would be a walk as long as he would cooperate. So this guy just he started making up stories, and they would take him around and like look for places where they might be at, and nothing really panned out, but he was still kind of charged for it.
But I can understand that to a certain extent, given the fact that it's a highly publicized case. There's news media covering it. You've been arrested by the FBI and now are looking at what's now a triple homicide, when the worst you might have done is I stole somebody's identity or I made some fraudulent charges. And then somebody says, all we need you to do is just tell us the truth. And, it won't be as bad for you.
So he actually confesses to the murders?
Yeah, he says, because it says, quote, everything would be a walk. He's pretty much saying that he was coerced, I think.
Or promised, hey, we'll help you out if you didn't have anything to do with the actual deaths. If you didn't kill them and you were only there as a after the fact, you helped cover it up, or then maybe we'll go easy on you.
Well, and as we've learned in a lot of the other cases, sometimes people just confess. They have
Right, false
no reason
confessions.
to at all.
Right.
But it happens. And it can obviously lead police in the wrong direction.
Right.
And even at one point, the man they have in custody even signs a statement saying that he killed Carol's son, slashing her throat at a remote mountain spot, even though that's not right. But
Yeah, she was strangled.
yeah.
Actually, I think it's important to keep in mind that their bodies were burned. So I don't know until Cary says that he strangled her, that the police or forensics can tell exactly how Carol had died. So him saying he slashed her neck might sound like something that's possible.
The fire covering up any chance of really identifying exactly how she was
Right. They may not think
killed.
it's a lie.
Right.
So all this stuff. And so they have all these guys in jail, and people start to feel better that they've caught.
Well, yeah, when the FBI comes out and local law enforcement and says, well, we have the group that did this terrible act and that they're going to get punishment. Why wouldn't, I'm going to
Right.
trust the authorities. And they have a confession, albeit a dubious one, and other evidence that they can take to a court, I imagine.
Yeah. We're going to stop here on this episode. We will pick it back up next time with talking about Joey Armstrong and the confession and the trial.
The information for this cold case comes from the Calaveras County District Attorney's website, the Union Democrat, the Stockton Record, and most especially from a series of 2 articles called A Lonely Road, Part 1 and 2 by Gray George from the Calaveras Enterprise and written in 2014. Sherilyn Murphy was only 23 years old when she disappeared from Sacramento, California in September of 1994. The last time she was seen, she was picked up by her mother near her Watts Avenue home in North Highlands area of Sacramento to go to an appointment with a doctor at a clinic in downtown Sacramento in an effort to enter into treatment for drug addiction. Murphy never returned from that appointment. When she didn't come home, her family searched for Sherilyn, putting up posters, handing out flyers, and praying. They also filed a police report. On October 4th, 1994, Sherilyn Murphy's severed hands were found in the New Maloney's Lake underneath Parrott's Ferry Bridge in an area of the lake known as Dead Man's Gulch. One of the hands was found floating inside a plastic bag, while the other was not in a plastic bag and found on shore. Then on December 13th, 1994, several young men who were clearing brush near their family's cabin found a body whose head and hands had been severed. The body was found on a very steep hill about 3 miles east of Vallecito on Camp 9 Road. Police and cadaver dogs searched the area and did not find any other clues as to the murder of Sherilyn Murphy. An autopsy concluded that Sherilyn Murphy was murdered by multiple stab wounds and that her head and hands were removed post-mortem. An anthropologist also studied her body and determined that she had wounds from a sharp-edged weapon and wounds indicating she tried to defend herself. The hands that had been found only yielded one thumbprint that was usable, and police in Calaveras County, where New Maloney's is located, set out to identify the victim. It would take over a year of exhaustive searches through the Department of Justice records, missing person records, and DMV records before detectives would finally find a match with the thumbprint of Sherilyn Murphy in the Washington State Patrol computer system. Her family was notified her body was found in December of 1995. Police have very little evidence to tell them who murdered Sherilyn Murphy and are asking anyone with information to come forward. The area the body and hands were found is in a remote area, but near campgrounds, hiking trails, and cabins. Police believe someone from the area or who knows the area may be involved. Sherilyn also worked as a sex worker in a very dangerous area of Sacramento, and her death may be connected to someone she knew or came into contact there. The area her body was found was very steep, so it may also be possible that police are looking for more than one person. Sherilyn Murphy was born and lived most of her life in Washington State. Growing up, she loved animals, singing, and painting. She had a special bond with her younger sister, who she loved to help take care of. One of her biggest accomplishments came when she won a church singing competition by singing Father's Eyes by Amy Grant. She was a very hard worker at jobs and was a student in cosmetology school in Washington. She moved to Sacramento, California to be near her mother in either 1992 or 1993. Both police and Sherilyn Murphy's family are still searching for answers in her murder. They and Sherilyn deserve justice. In 2014, Sherilyn's sister, Crystal, told the Calaveras Enterprise, quote, "When I lost my sister, I lost part of my soul. Losing Sherilyn has been the greatest loss of my life. Sherilyn's body was returned to her family in 2002 and her ashes scattered in ocean shores in Washington state. If you have any information about the death of Sherilyn Murphy, please call Calaveras County Sheriffs at 209-754-6500.
Thank you for listening to another episode of California True Crime. Remember, you can always follow us on social media at Cali True Crime on Twitter or Instagram, as well as our Facebook. You can also email us at calitruecrime@gmail.com. Don't forget to listen and rate and review us on your favorite podcasting app. That does help us. We'd also like to thank Melanie Duncan, the person that always keeps the quality in control in this podcast. This has been a production of Chateau Walnut.